He was not born into greatness. In Arpinum, far from the marble glare of Rome, the boy watched the Tiber River swell only in stories. Marcus Tullius Cicero was provincial, sharp, untested. His family bore the horseman's rank, noble enough to hope, but not to rule. The blood of Rome did not course through his veins, only its ambition. His father, half-blind and book-bound, believed the Republic could still reward merit. And in the hush of twilight readings, while the world outside chased power with steel, Cicero learned to wield his own weapon, words. He mimicked Demosthenes in the candlelight, stuffing pebbles in his mouth to master clarity, reciting laws until his throat bruised, measuring not just tone but truth. Rome, he believed, could still be persuaded. It could be reasoned with. It could be saved, not with swords, but with syllables. He studied in Athens, watched the shadows of Plato's academy stretch over broken stones, and wondered if minds alone could hold off collapse. When he returned to Rome, his voice was not yet feared, but it was heard. His first cases won applause from the forum crowds, his arguments neat as mosaics, binding sense with style. He did not flatter the masses. He addressed them as citizens. That, in time, would become dangerous. But in these early days, he still believed. The Republic was not yet rotting, only bruised. And bruises could heal, he told himself, if good men stood up. He rose quickly, climbing the cursus honorum, always by merit, always with a practiced humility. And at each step, he seemed to be asking Rome, will you listen? And for a while, it did. He would not inherit power. He would not buy it. He would earn it, word by word. When he prosecuted Verres, the corrupt governor of Sicily, the courtroom shook. Not from shouts, but from silence. Cicero read the charges, each accusation like a bell tolling through the temple of Castor and Pollux. The senators shifted in their seats. Even Verres knew the trial was lost before Cicero finished his opening oration. The man fled Rome that night. The people, for once, did not cheer blood. They cheered law. They cheered the idea that Rome could still be ruled by justice, not bribes or fear. And Cicero, in the quiet after, allowed himself the thought, the Republic could be repaired. Not remade, not revolutionized, but returned to its better self. He did not dream of empire. He dreamed of balance. Of peace. Of orators, not generals, deciding the fate of nations. But the tide of Rome was already shifting beneath him, slow and cold. And words, no matter how golden, could not stop a flood. Still, for now, he stood. And Rome listened. Poetic reflection. From stone and script the voice may rise. Yet time will test if reason flies. A whisper true can stir the halls. But cannot mend when empire falls. It was not thunder that shook Rome that year, it was a voice. Clear, cutting, almost fragile in its restraint, yet it carried farther than a soldier's shout. In 63 BCE, Marcus Tullius Cicero stood as consul of the Roman Republic, a position once reserved for the great names of patrician legacy. But Cicero had climbed the marble steps with nothing but his intellect and an unwavering faith in mos maiorum, the traditions of the ancestors. The Senate had not seen such an orator in a generation, and few were prepared for what he would make of the office. He wore the toga with dignity, but it was not power he craved, it was permanence. The chance to hold the crumbling edifice of the Republic upright, if only for one more year, one more breath. The Senate chambers, once a forum of reason, had become a theater of whispers and alliances carved in coin. Yet Cicero spoke plainly, refusing to flatter either the mob or the aristocrats. That made him dangerous. He had enemies now, quiet ones. Men who smiled as he passed, who nodded at his speeches, and plotted in corridors when the candles dimmed. Clodius Pulcher, young and reckless, tasted blood in every syllable Cicero uttered. Crassus, swollen with wealth, found Cicero's insistence on legality insulting. And Julius Caesar, ambitious, patient, and smiling always, watched Cicero as one might study a flame, fascinated, but already preparing water. But Cicero still believed the Republic could be moved by words. So he spoke, and he listened. And when the Senate drifted into torpor, he woke them with his wit. When they surrendered to expedience, he reminded them of Rome's soul. His speeches were not just arguments, they were acts of memory, each one a plea to recall who they had been, and a warning of what they were becoming. He walked the streets after Senate sessions, head bowed in thought, watched by those who whispered that he was not nobilis. Not one of them. That he had come too far, too fast. But Cicero did not flinch. He had no legions. Only logic. No banners. Only books. And yet his voice, for a brief moment in Rome's long twilight, held the city still. When he passed laws, it was with caution. When he punished, it was reluctantly. He sought to contain ambition, not extinguish it. He tried to balance. To moderate. To hold Pompey back without silencing him. To warn Caesar without antagonizing him. But the lines were fraying. The center could not hold forever. Cicero's oratory, once admired, began to feel inconvenient to the powerful. His popularity with the people, once his armor, began to fade as new demagogues arose. Their words were louder, simpler, bloodier. Rome no longer wanted truth, it wanted noise. And the Senate, frightened, began to shift its gaze to men with swords. Still, Cicero persisted. He thought if he could speak clearly enough, bravely enough, perhaps he could remind Rome of its better angels. Perhaps his voice could bind what violence had begun to tear. He did not yet know that the louder he spoke, the more he became a target. But in the Forum, under the sun that beat down on cracked marble and restless crowds, he still believed, words could win. Poetic reflection. The louder truth was made to ring. The more it stirred the wrath of kings. When marble yields to iron's weight, the voice must choose, speak loud, or wait. He had seen it in Catiline's eyes before the Senate did, in the glint of practiced charm, in the way his hands moved too easily over words that promised change. Lucius Sergius Catilina was not the first man to drape ambition in patriotism, but he was among the most brazen. Cicero had debated him once before, had measured the man's thirst for office, his hunger for revenge, and now, as consul, he sensed a storm gathering behind the smiles. Catiline was losing. Losing the elections. Losing the patience of Rome's upper crust. But he was gaining something far more dangerous, the loyalty of the angry, the desperate, the armed. Veterans without land. Debtors without hope. Youth without future. And all of them, for the first time, listening to a man who promised not to reform the Republic, but to end it, and build something sharper in its place. Cicero felt it first not in the Forum, but in the silence between meetings. Senators who once whispered to him now looked away. Friends hesitated. Rome's streets trembled under a tension he could not name, until one night, a letter arrived, unsigned, unsealed, but deadly in its implication. A warning of plots. Of fire. Of swords drawn in the shadows. He did not panic. He observed. He gathered more letters, more whispers. And then, he stood before the Senate, not with soldiers, but with sentences, and named Catiline for what he was. Not a rival. A traitor. His in Catilinum orations rang through the Curia like the toll of a funeral bell, each word chosen not only to indict, but to awaken. He did not shout. He revealed. How long, O Catiline, will you abuse our patience? He saw Catiline's face darken. Saw the mask slip, just for a moment. And then, silence. The room froze. It was not the guards who forced Catiline to flee, it was shame, perhaps, or the cold realization that Cicero had beaten him without raising a single sword. But the danger had only just begun. Catiline fled to raise an army. His co-conspirators remained in Rome. And Cicero, granted emergency powers, had to act. He did not act out of vengeance. He weighed the law. Consulted. Waited. And then, reluctantly, signed the order that would mark him forever. The execution of Roman citizens without trial. 5 men. No blood in the forum, only a quiet parade to the Tullianum prison. No spectacle, just a rope. Cicero returned to the people and said only, "Vixerunt." They have lived. The crowd applauded. For now. But in the silence after the applause, he began to feel the fracture. The old republic would have tried them. Would have let law do the killing. Cicero had acted as savior, but at the cost of precedent. And Rome remembered such things. The next day, he walked through the streets with a laurel crown and the title Pater Patrii, Father of the Fatherland. But his eyes did not shine. He knew, in the marrow of his bones, that something had been spent that could never be returned. A line had been crossed. He had done what he thought necessary. But necessity and righteousness are not the same. The Republic had survived the conspiracy. But it had changed. And so had he. Poetic reflection. The blade that guards may open veins. And he who saves still bears the stains. One silence won through rope and fear. Will echo louder, year by year. It began not with a trial, but with a silence. The kind that settles when old friends stop writing, when senators look past you in the forum, when the crowds, once so eager to applaud, no longer meet your gaze. Cicero had once saved the Republic, but Rome had a short memory and an even shorter appetite for gratitude. Clodius Pulcher, now tribune of the plebs, had waited patiently. And now, like a wolf who smells a weakened stag, he pounced. There was no new crime. Only the old one, executing citizens without a trial. But now it was framed not as justice, but murder. And Cicero, stripped of his consulship's protections, stood alone. Pompey, once a cautious ally, offered no defense. Caesar, ever careful, offered ambiguity. And the Senate, grateful yet frightened, offered only silence. They did not arrest him. They did not kill him. That would have made him a martyr. Instead, they erased him. A vote of exile. A decree that no friend should host him, no town receive him, no Roman home remember him. His house on the Palatine was torn down, brick by brick, while Clodius smiled from the rostra. In its place, a shrine to liberty, an insult too pointed to miss. Cicero left Rome by night, walking not as a condemned man but as a ghost. His wife, Terentia, remained. His children, too. He carried little. Just scrolls. Letters. And an ache so deep it rewrote his gait. Through Campania, through Brundisium, he walked with the salt wind of the Adriatic stinging his eyes, though whether from the sea or from sorrow, even he could not say. Exile did not wound him with hunger or chains. It wounded him with irrelevance. In Thessalonica, he sat for days at a time, staring at the floor, drafting letters no one would answer. He had once moved empires with his voice, and now he spoke only to himself. It was not death. But it was a rehearsal. And yet even in exile, he wrote. Letters to friends who might still care. Treatises on duty, law, the nature of the gods. He tried to reason with his pain. Tried to make it virtuous. He did not believe in self-pity, but he practiced it with discipline. Then, almost as suddenly as he had fallen, he was recalled. The tides of politics turned. Clodius lost favor. Pompey needed legitimacy again. And the Senate, cowardly as ever, sought to cleanse its conscience. So they invited Cicero back. Not with laurels this time, but with whispers, return, and speak again. His ship landed at Brundisium in a pale dawn. The crowds that once cheered him were smaller now, older, more uncertain. Cicero waved. Smiled. But inside, he no longer believed in the simple geometry of public virtue. He would serve the Republic still, but something in him had shifted. He returned to find his house gone, his name used carelessly in jokes, his enemies grown bold. Rome was not what it had been. Or perhaps it had always been this way, and only now did he see it clearly. He spoke again in the Senate. Wrote again with fire. But there was a slowness to his steps, a quiet in his eyes. Exile had not broken him. It had refined him. But it had also left cracks in places he did not yet understand. Poetic reflection. The tongue once crowned, now whispers low. Its edge still sharp, but tempered so. The road that leads a voice to shame. Returns it not with voice the same. The Republic did not fall in a single day. It decayed, like marble exposed to years of rain, its edges dulled, its meanings eroded, until even its ruins forgot what they once stood for. Cicero watched this slow undoing with a kind of quiet horror, like a man who returns to his childhood home only to find strangers living there, repainting over memory with ambition. He had returned from exile to a Rome where law bent to convenience, where generals bargained with the Senate as if it were a market, and where Caesar and Pompey, two names once tethered by careful balance, now circled each other with sharpened smiles. Cicero, always the optimist of the Republic, tried to mediate. But moderation was no longer a virtue. It was weakness. He pleaded for compromise. He reminded the Senate of what it once meant to deliberate. He begged Pompey not to press too hard, not to let his fear of Caesar become justification for tyranny. And he wrote to Caesar, even praised him when it served peace. But neither man truly heard him. They were no longer playing within the boundaries of the Republic. They were building machines to tear it down. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Cicero did not cheer. He did not choose sides. He sat in his study, ink drying beside an unfinished letter, and felt the air change. The die was not just cast, it was melting the dice themselves. All rules would soon be ash. He fled again. Not in exile this time, but in retreat. First to Formii, then to Brundisium, trailing news of battles like a shadow. Pharsalus came. Pompey fell. Caesar wrote kindly to Cicero afterward, invited him to return. And Cicero did. Not with joy. With weariness. Rome was quieter now. There was no war in the streets, only in the conscience. Caesar forgave easily, almost too easily. He smiled at Cicero, welcomed him back to the Senate, even honored him. But Cicero knew the meaning of that smile. It was not friendship. It was power showing mercy. And mercy, wielded like a gift, was its own kind of control. He spoke less in those years. He wrote more. Letters to Atticus, reflections on old age, treatises on duty and republics, half consolations, half elegies. His voice still carried weight, but the chamber it spoke in had changed. It no longer echoed. It absorbed. He had once believed in the Senate's ability to steer the state. Now he watched it applaud Caesar's victories, rename months in his honor, build statues in his image. And still, Cicero walked among them, a monument of his own, crumbling by degrees, honored by men who had no use for honor. He thought often of Cato. Of Brutus. Of the Stoics who chose death over compromise. And he wondered, not for the first time, if his words had only delayed what swords would ultimately decide. He wrote, and waited. Poetic reflection. Not every fall begins with flame. Some die beneath the weight of shame. And those who watch from wisdom's keep may see the end, but not yet weep. He no longer trusted the Senate to listen, so he turned to parchment. The letters flowed like prayers, unanswered, unceasing. To Atticus, to his brother Quintus, to friends fading like the old republic itself. Some were careful, political, others read like monologues spoken into a well. In each, Cicero tried to capture what the world was losing, its dignity, its restraint, its memory of itself. Rome had become louder and emptier. Caesar ruled now not as a consul, but as a man above law. Dictator. Not by whisper, but by acclamation. He walked among men who bowed before him without command. And Cicero, though spared, though still clothed in respect, began to feel the loneliness that only accompanies those who still believe in something no one else does. He did not attend the Senate often. When he did, his voice was polite, distant. He watched as Caesar spoke first, and others repeated him. The chamber that had once trembled at his orations now buzzed with hollow applause. It was not just that the Republic was dying, it was that so few seemed to notice. In his villa at Tusculum, among cypresses and scrolls, Cicero began to write what would outlast him. De Officiis, De Republica, De Legibus. Not treatises, really, confessions in the form of philosophy. He imagined a student, generations hence, reading by lamplight and asking, what did it mean to be Roman? And Cicero, across time, would answer, to serve the residential publica even when it no longer serves you. He mourned quietly for Tullia, his daughter, his joy, his mirror. She had died young, and though he consoled others with stoic words, her absence hollowed him. He built her a shrine, and in the night, walked circles around it, murmuring lines from Plato and saying nothing at all. Her death had no politics. It was the one thing the Republic had not corrupted. And still, the letters came. Brutus, now back in favor, wrote in guarded tones. Cassius hinted at darker plans. There were whispers of what would come, the Ides. Cicero did not join them. But he did not warn Caesar either. Perhaps he knew Caesar would not have listened. Perhaps some part of him wanted the Republic to be shocked back into memory, even by blood. When the daggers found Caesar beneath Pompey's statue, Cicero was not there. But he heard the city's breath catch. The tyrant was gone, and yet, no joy followed. No restoration. No rush of liberty. Only panic. Cicero walked through the forum that night and knew, Caesar had been a symptom, not the cause. The disease was deeper. He wrote more feverishly after that. Letters, essays, dialogues with dead philosophers. It was not activism now. It was preservation. A voice trying to leave footprints on water. And he hoped, against reason, that someone might read him not as a relic, but as a warning. Poetic reflection. When echoes fail and fires dim, the pen still carves a requiem. If no one listens in the square, then write for ghosts who still might care. It began again with a voice. Not a young voice, not a hopeful one, but the voice of a man who had lived too long and seen too much, still standing in the Senate where statues wept dust. Cicero had withdrawn after Caesar's death, watching with weary eyes as Mark Antony stepped into the vacuum, speaking not as a servant of the Republic, but as its new interpreter. Antony was not Caesar. He lacked Caesar's precision, his cold elegance. He was bolder, cruder, more theatrical. But he understood the crowd. He knew how to turn grief into rage, how to wave a bloody toga and make the plebs roar. Cicero watched him give Caesar a funeral not of mourning, but of mobilization. And Rome, once again, bent toward a single will. It was then that Cicero returned to the rostra. Not in youth's triumph, but in elder defiance. The Philippics began as words, just words, spoken against Antony's rise. He called him a drunkard, a thief of power, a betrayer of the Republic masked in mourning. And he did not stop. Speech after speech, he poured his soul into condemnation, warning that Antony was not a man, but a symptom of what Rome had become, indifferent to law, addicted to violence, blind to dignity. His voice, surprisingly, still carried. For a time, the Senate rallied. The optimates raised their heads again. Cicero threw his weight behind Octavian, the quiet heir of Caesar, a boy who promised moderation, legality, a return to order. Cicero knew the risk, Octavian was untested, ambiguous. But Cicero believed he could shape him. That perhaps, in backing one Caesar to stop another, he might preserve what remained. He was wrong. The moment was brief. Like a candle burning too bright before it gutters. For a few months, it seemed Antony would fall. The Senate empowered Cicero to speak, to lead. But power, once granted, no longer belonged to the speaker. It belonged to those who heard, and chose silence. Octavian made his move. A deal with Antony. A new triumvirate, Antony, Octavian, and Lepidus. 3 men bound not by law, but by necessity and shared interest. Their pact was sealed not in ink, but in blood. They drew up a list. Cicero's name was on it. Octavian did not fight it. He let it happen. Cicero had made himself a liability, too eloquent, too known, too much a reminder of what Rome once was. They could not build their new world with him still speaking. He heard of the proscription from a friend. He did not run. Not far. He lingered near his villa in Formii, eyes on the sea, letters half-written. When the soldiers came, he did not beg. He asked only for a moment, to compose himself, to offer his throat cleanly, to make the death of a senator look more like a choice than a slaughter. He was killed in silence. They took his hands, the very ones that had written against tyranny. They nailed them, and his head, to the rostra, where he had once stood and dared to speak. And the forum watched. Poetic reflection. The tongue that dared defy the crown was cut, and nailed, and pointed down. Yet though the speaker's breath was stilled, the silence left was louder still. They called it justice. They called it peace. They called it necessary. But Rome, that ancient stage where orators once steered destinies with breath alone, now stood quieter beneath the weight of its own compromises. The rostra, where words had once lit fires in hearts and chilled the spines of tyrants, bore a new image now, a severed head, grayed and bloodied, with lips half open as if to speak one final time. His hands, nailed beside him, hung limp, those same hands that had penned the Republic's most careful arguments, that had reached across aisles in hope, that had turned pages in the silence of exile, searching for what still bound men to law. Cicero, who had never commanded a legion, who had never ruled from force, was dead. And the city he loved watched it happen with averted eyes. In the homes of patricians, shutters stayed closed. In the taverns, the common folk whispered. No one cheered. No one mourned aloud. Rome had learned that memory was dangerous, and remembrance could be punishable. Octavian said nothing. Mark Antony said it was done. Lepidus, as always, said little. But the people remembered. In fragments. In lines. In stories told to grandchildren by those who had once heard his voice ring against stone walls. He stood alone, they said. He believed too much. He spoke when it was safer to be quiet. He died for a republic that had already stopped listening. And that, perhaps, was the truth of it. The republic had not been murdered by men like Antony or even Caesar. It had faded, slowly, as good men chose comfort, as crowds traded freedom for spectacle, and as laws bent to favor instead of justice. Cicero was not perfect, vain, cautious, sometimes blind, but he had believed. Even when the forum emptied. Even when the mobs cheered louder for war than for words. His death was not a turning point. It was a tombstone. Not for a man, but for an idea, that reason could rule, that rhetoric could tame ambition, that Rome could govern itself. Years passed. Octavian became Augustus. The Republic was renamed an empire, and its trappings preserved like bones dressed in purple. Temples still stood. Senators still spoke. But the decisions were made elsewhere, behind doors, by one man. And yet, Cicero lived on, in ink, in memory. In the margins of philosophy students centuries later, tracing his Latin to understand the fall of law and the rise of force. In the breath of future orators, who spoke not to survive, but to mean something. He was gone. But not lost. Poetic reflection. The voice is dust, the hands undone. Because they served, eclipsed by sun. But buried deep in broken stone. A whisper waits. You are not alone. And if you still believe that words matter, that memory has power, and that history still speaks, then subscribe to Imperium Echo. We carry the echoes forward.